Thanks very much for having me here. I'm here to talk about compost, shockingly. What am I going to talk about? Well, what is compost? Where does it come from? What makes a good compost, an appropriate compost? The reason we think this is important is because if you're purchasing a product, you want it to be a quality product, and your chances of getting a quality product will be better. Your ability to find one that a quality product will be better if you understand what it is, where it comes from. And so we're going to go into that with some detail. So compost, definition of compost. One definition from the dictionary is an accumulation of decaying or decayed organic matter, as from leaves and manure, used to improve soil structure and to provide nutrients. Point here is that compost is produced by a biological process. It's decay. But this decay is controlled by the composter to maintain optimal conditions for creating the compost so that the compost is produced quickly and reliably and effectively. But it's a biological process, not a chemical process. There are a variety of different ways to create compost, of course. Some of you may do backyard composting, and you may be familiar with it. There's something called vermicomposting, which is using worms to create compost. But we're going to be talking about thermophilic composting. In most cases, thermophilic composting is what we're talking about when we're talking about the kinds of compost that you would purchase in the marketplace. And this is what a typical thermophilic composting site would look like. Now, there are other composting sites, other composting facilities that don't look like this, and we'll be talking about those too. But in a thermophilic composting site, commercial scale, you're talking about a really long pile, which is called a windrow. And the composter is managing that pile to maintain or create and maintain an ideal environment for microbes. Because, right, this is a biological process. It's a microbiological process. And within the pile, there are three classes of microorganisms that are most important. There are the bacteria. Bacteria are doing most of the work in the pile. They're very small. They work very, very quickly and very efficiently. And there are fungi in the pile. Fungi are much larger. They grow more slowly, but they're able to break down certain compounds that bacteria have trouble decomposing. Finally, there are actinomycetes, which I think are really interesting. They're actually bacteria. They're bacteria that grow end to end. So they grow in association with each other. And in a compost pile, you can actually see them. If you've ever had a pile and you look at the outside of the pile when it's warm, when it's cooking, sometimes you can see sort of a grayish, bluish looking haze almost, this network of stuff growing through the compost. It's usually in like the outer 10 inches or so. And those are actinomycetes. And they decompose the material. They also are responsible for the odor that you want in a compost. That when you have a nice, well-cured compost, it should smell like humus, and your body knows. I mean, your nose will tell you if this smells like a forest floor, if it smells like something humusy and rich and organic, something you'd want to use, versus something that smells rancid or off. That humus, forest floor type smell, that's the actinomycetes that you're smelling. This talk circles around a couple of times. And we're gonna go through some ideas and look at things in a couple of different ways. So if you find that you think I'm repeating myself, I am, but not in the same way. So composting, it's an aerobic process. By that I mean it requires oxygen. During the compost process, you have the compost, which serve as the food for the microbes. And so the microbes are eating the food, and the food is carbon. And they break down the carbon and convert it to carbon dioxide, water, compost, and heat. And to do this, they need oxygen. In order to make these reactions go, all reactions, chemical reactions, have to balance, right? People who took chemistry, you remember banging your head trying to make these things balance, whereas microbes just do it naturally. When the carbon is converted from organic forms to carbon dioxide, there are these excess electrons that get generated, and they have to go somewhere. And it turns out oxygen is a really great place to put them. And then the oxygen, the O2 gas in the atmosphere, is then converted to carbon dioxide, which is given off as a waste product. We call this process respiration. Now, this should sound very familiar to each of you because it's what we do too. right? All of you had breakfast, or you should have had breakfast if you didn't have breakfast. I didn't have breakfast, but I should have. No, I did. Yes, I did. I just remembered. I did have breakfast. I had some cereal. Okay, good for me, and good for you. All right, so we're breaking down our breakfast. We are using that for energy. We're breathing. Anybody ever wonder why you breathe? Why do you breathe? You know you need to breathe. Why do you do it? Because you're breaking down your breakfast or your lunch or your snack or whatever, and you're taking that carbon and you're changing it from organic forms to carbon dioxide. And the reason we're using oxygen is because it's really efficient as an electron acceptor. So we're doing exactly the same thing. Now, microbes can use other things as electron acceptors. You know, they can use sulfur, for example, which gives off hydrogen sulfide, which is a nice rotten egg smell. So we want to use oxygen. Oxygen is ideal. We're giving off carbon dioxide. You breathe on a mirror, cold mirror, fogs up, right? That's probably not the water you drank. That's probably water that you're generating as you break down your breakfast or lunch. You're giving off carbon dioxide, water. You're giving off heat. If this was a warm day in a closed room and our air conditioning wasn't working so well, we'd learn that really, really quickly. It gets moist and hot and sticky. We don't give off compost. We give off other things, which are sometimes composted very effectively. Okay, and we call it respiration too. So, see, we have lots in common with microbes. Microbes actually live in our guts and help us to some extent. Thermophilic composting. Microbes, more about microbes. Microbes tend to specialize in the temperatures that they prefer. They like hot temperatures. Why? Because their biochemistry is much more effective at warmer temperatures. But different species actually prefer different temperatures. We have some species that really like cold temperatures. We have some temperatures that like ambient temperatures, mesophilic temperatures. And then we have some that like hot temperatures, and those are the thermophiles. Now, that is important. So at different temperatures, you have different species of microorganisms that tend to have relative advantages depending on the temperatures that are going on. So you get this ecological shift as temperatures change. And we take advantage of that in composting. Now, in this room, this would be mesophilic conditions. That's what we like. That's what most microbes like, because most of the environment is at mesophilic temperatures, which just kind of means medium temperatures. And pathogens are mesophiles, which makes sense, because what are pathogens going to do? Pathogens have to survive in the environment, not at high temperatures, but at ambient temperatures, to infect somebody else, and then they enter that somebody else, and that somebody else's temperatures are kind of at ambient temperatures, right? 98.6. It's not terribly hot. Gets hotter than that in Riverside, where I live, pretty regularly. So those are, ambient temperatures. But as you get hotter than that, above 110 degrees, up to, say, 155, maybe 165, thermophiles dominate, a totally different spectrum of microorganisms. Not necessarily totally, but a different spectrum of microorganisms. The thing is that pathogens don't survive at thermophilic temperatures very well. They're kind of wimpy. They do really well in the environment that they've adapted to survive in, which is like you. But they don't do well outside of that environment. They kind of hang on in the environment, but when it gets, they survive. Then they get into a host, they multiply. But you get them up above 131 degrees, and you get very reliable inactivation of viruses, bacteria that are pathogenic, helminths, which are worm eggs, and worms. They're all inactivated, and we have a lot of literature on this that shows that it's quite reliable. Another thing about heat is that it greatly accelerates microbial efficiency. It turns out that the rate of biochemical reactions about doubles for every 18 degrees Fahrenheit or every 10 degrees centigrade. We're moving from, say, 72 degrees atmospheric temperatures, and we move up into a compost pile where we're trying to run it around 150 degrees, and we're doubling every 18 degrees. How much faster are those reactions going to occur? About 25 times faster. 25 times faster. So you can see why a composter would want to another reason to maintain these hot temperatures is they're moving the compost through faster. And composters are all business people. And they make money by accepting material and moving it through. They don't make any money by having it sit on site. That just annoys neighbors. They don't want to do that. So they want to move it through. If they have it at these thermophilic temperatures, they can move it through that much more quickly. And this should be intuitive to you, because when you ate your breakfast this morning, you probably took it out of the refrigerator. And if you had left it out overnight, it might have gone bad. Right? We keep things in the refrigerator, keep them cool, because it slows down microbial activity. And you know that if you leave something out in the sun, microbial activity accelerates and things spoil. Okay? So you know about this too. It's part of your life. So why compost? This particular farmer is an organic farmer, and he had some really beautiful watermelons that day that I broke my heart to see them going into the pile. But I guess he thought that maybe they were slightly overripe or they wouldn't make it to market in time. So he was using it to improve his soils and also as a way to dispose of produce that he hadn't gotten out quickly enough. Next. But the reason we compost is, one, to eliminate disease organisms. Now, these are animal diseases. We don't want to transmit, say, cow to cow. Plant diseases. Farmers really do not want to import diseases into their plants. Landscapers. If you have compost that's coming from landscapes, you don't know where that material has come from. You don't know, what happens when plants get sick. They can get collected, chipped up, and you want, when you get a material, to know that it's not going to infect your landscape, right? So plant diseases are controlled just as effectively as the human pathogens, and there can be human pathogens in feedstock materials. Even sewage sludge, biosolids, are regularly composted, and there's been a long history of that, and they've been used very, very successfully here in Southern California for since the early 50s. And again, in that case, you're controlling for human disease organisms. We also want to produce a nice, stable soil amendment, one that's not going to tie up nutrients, one that's not going to have odors that are unacceptable, and one that's not going to contain phytotoxins, that is, chemicals that can damage plants. There are two phases to the compost process. Okay? The first is called the active composting phase, and that's when things are hot. That's when things are thermophilic. During the active composting phase, the microbes are managed. Okay, they're catered to. All right, they're nurtured along by the composters because they want the microbes to work quickly and effectively, and so they're given everything they need. They're given all the water they need. They're given all the air they need. They're turned. They're given all the food they need, and they go nuts. They go nuts. It's like a microbial orgy. Okay, it's a huge keg party. It's or to be more, maybe a little more. I got a couple of kids now, and I don't really think in terms of keg parties anymore. I think in terms of Go Dog Go, the big party in the tree, right? At the end, but what happens in parties? It makes a mess, right? People in parties, they're not paying attention. They're not incredibly efficient with their food. They spill things. And so it's a bit also like the Cat in the Hat. And the Cat in the Hat comes over and he's playing with things and he's having a great time. And he makes a big mess. And then Mom's coming home because she heard Child Protective Services was on the way. And she left her kids alone all day. And she's racing home to beat Child Protective Services. And then the fish sees Mom. And it's a big mess. And what are we going to do? And that's what the curing phase does. Cat in the Hat shows up with the big machine, cleans everything up. The curing phase takes the incompletely decomposed byproducts, the spilled beer, say, and cleans it up. It gives the compost time to completely break down any compounds that may be odoriferous or phytotoxic, because during the compost process, as I say, things are happening so fast that there are things like organic acids and other compounds that, or amines, which I'll talk about, which smell bad and can be toxic to plants. During the curing process, the material is typically just allowed to sit and mellow. And microbes continue to work at a slower rate and they break down and thoroughly decompose any of these compounds that may be left over so that we have a material that's nice and we call mature. Basically means ready to use. Carbon, source of energy for microbes. Now the thing about carbon is not all sources of carbon are equally available. We have, again, we have a lot in common here. Sugars, fats, waxes, proteins, readily available. Microbes, take it, eat it, decompose it right away. No trouble at all. Cellulose is the most predominant organic compound on the face of the earth. It's the stuff paper's made out of. It's what forms most of plants, particularly trees are made of cellulose. It's not something we can eat. Cows can eat it. Cows can eat it because they have a stomach that contains microbes that can break down cellulose, and they do part of the work, and then the cow does the rest. So, but we can't make use of cellulose for food. Lignin is the second most common organic compound on the face of the earth, and it's less available, which is really a good thing because what lignin does is cellulose gives structures to trees, other plants too, but I'm going to talk about trees. But bacteria, I just told you, they can break down cellulose, and we make these buildings out of wood. It would be really bad if bacteria could come along and just eat this wood up. So in the environment, there's this lignin, which is this really complicated, gnarly-looking molecule that wraps itself around cellulose. And the microbes look at this molecule and they go, I don't even know where to begin, and they can't eat it. And that's why our trees stand up. Now, I had a professor back in grad school who was like the founder of soil microbiology as a field, which is it's kind of nice. There was a time when you could be the founder of your field. He would get these guys writing him every once in a while and say, hey, I got this great idea. Let's genetically re-engineer bacteria so they can break down lignin. And he would write them back quickly and say, that's crazy. All our houses would fall down. And so that was never done. Now, it turns out that fungi can break down lignin. It just takes a long time. And so that's why when you're out in the woods, sometimes you'll see a branch sitting there, and there'll be like this fungus growing on it, and it's breaking down the lignin to get at the cellulose, and then bacteria can come along at that point and help out. And composters will add carbon. They're very careful to make sure there's food for their microbes. And this farmer's using hay. Nitrogen is the most important nutrient for microbes. They use it for protein synthesis, and they use it also to build up their genetic material, like DNA. The N is for nitrogen. If there's too much nitrogen in a pile, it can volatilize from the pile. It goes off as a gas in the form of ammonia. And I have this slide that I used to show, and I don't have it here for you because it's an actual 35 millimeter slide, and I can't figure out how to stick it in my computer. But I had a colleague running by, this was one of my first calls when I first got to the University of California, a colleague running by a big pile of what they were doing then was 100% biosolids composting. And you couldn't get away with that now. This was 1992. And it was on Indian land, so regulators were restricted to a certain extent. Anyway, he's running by this pile of 100% biosolids that's being composted, and there's this big plume coming up. And he's tearing by because he doesn't want to get hit by anything. And I asked my students, hey, what do you think that smells like? And they go, oh, gross. And I say, it smells just like Mr. Clean because it's ammonia. It's water vapor and ammonia. Now, there are other compounds in compost that, as you get further away, actually up front, you really smell the ammonia in a situation like that. As you get further away, you can smell some other stuff. There are other nitrogenous compounds that can be even more odoriferous, but you don't smell them until the ammonia kind of dissipates a bit. But they smell nastier, like the amines come from protein decomposition, and they have colorful names like putrescine, cadaverine. So there are other nitrogenous compounds that can smell bad, They're important for plants. They're a very important critical nutrient. In a compost, you want the nitrogen to be slowly decomposed and released into the soil. A composter will typically, what they'll do is they'll start with a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 35:1. So they want to make sure there's enough energy, that the balance between the energy and the nutrients is correct. So you have enough nitrogen to supply the microbes, but not too much. And during the compost process, what happens is the compost is evolved as carbon dioxide, right? And the nitrogen, some of it goes off as ammonia, but it's mostly recycled by the microbes. They fight over it. And so what happens over time is the carbon to nitrogen ratio drops. And your final product is going to be typically on the order of 10 to 20 to 1. It depends. All of these things kind of depend. Your local situation can vary. Oh, watermelon is a great source of nitrogen. So that's what he's using. Most people don't use watermelons, believe it or not. Oxygen acts as an electron acceptor and permits efficient liberation of energy from the carbon. The energy is used by the microbes to grow and reproduce. It's a turned windrow, and you've all probably heard about turning your compost pile. And you may wonder why. You probably have never wondered why you turn your compost pile. But I'm going to tell you why, because it's not what you think. Next. All right. In the compost pile, what happens is it's decomposing, right? And when things decompose, they settle. Oxygen has to get into the pile. What happens, and this is where I need to point, the middle of the pile is hot. And there are gases in the middle of the pile. It's carbon dioxide, moisture, and nitrogen. These gases expand. And what happens to hot gases? They expand, they get lighter, and then they rise, like a hot air balloon. Well, as that hot air leaves, cool air comes in from the sides, and that cool air is rich in oxygen. So you have this engine driving air into the compost pile. But if you don't turn it, what happens is the pores that the air needs to get through the pile collapse because the thing is decomposing and settling in. So what you're doing when you turn the pile is fluffing it up. You do introduce some air when you turn the pile, but it's really gone very, very, very quickly. The microbes are, again, they're partying down, so it's gone. What you're doing is fluffing it up, and that's why you turn the pile. Not every operation is a turned windrow operation. As a matter of fact, we're seeing, even though turned windrows are really still by far the most common approach that's taken, we're starting to see more of these static pile and in-vessel systems. In a static pile system, you actually force air into or draw air out of a pile mechanically. So you're not turning it. And there are a couple of reasons you might want to do this. One is if you're drawing air out of a pile, you can actually capture that air and treat it if odors or VOCs or something are a concern. Or if you're blowing air into a pile, sometimes you can put cured compost on top. And that then acts as a biofilter, which means that the microbes in that cured compost will further treat any odors or other compounds. So you reduce air emissions. But probably the most important reason that people go to static piles is it saves space. You can put more of them closer together. And in places like San Juan Capistrano, where land is valuable, that can be a critical factor. Another composting, it's not really a technique, it's just a category. In-vessel systems are any compost systems that are indoors or contained. And you can put a turned windrow system indoors. It's pretty unusual. Static piles indoors are not unusual. There are other approaches. But if it's indoors, it's called in-vessel. The thing about in-vessel composting is they're really expensive. But you can get complete control of the environment. So really, really, really expensive. But sometimes that's what you have to do to meet air quality concerns or other concerns. Water. Microbes live in water. That's their habitat. Water clings to the compost particles. If there's too much water, it turns out oxygen moves into water pretty slowly. And so what you want is a lot of surface area for the oxygen to move in and the carbon dioxide to move out. And so if you have a saturated, sodden mess, like a bog, the oxygen can't penetrate. and then things go anaerobic, which means low oxygen. And that's when the microbes start looking for other places to put their electrons, and they can't find oxygen, so they start to use things like sulfur, creating hydrogen sulfide gases, or their reaction rates just slow down so much that those intermediate byproducts of decomposition that are phytotoxic and odoriferous never really have a chance to completely break down. Or because they're not using oxygen, remember I said it's really efficient. If you're using sulfur or something else, you're not going to get as much energy out. That means there's not as much heat generated, which means the piles don't increase their temperature, which means the reaction rates don't accelerate, and also means that pathogens are going to survive in greater numbers. In these are compost particles, and you can see that the pores, that's how the air moves in. You don't want the pile to be saturated. If you're composting your own in your backyard, basically, give it a squeeze test. You grab the compost, give it a gentle squeeze. You should see you should see water start to kind of glisten at the bottom of your hand, but it shouldn't be running out. The film of water has air on the outside, so it's aerobic. The outside of the compost particle is also receiving some air through the water, so that's aerobic. That's where the microbes are going to be doing their eating. In the inside of the particle, microbes can't eat because it's all blocked. It's just not available, and that's also going to be anaerobic. So a composter has, they have certain parameters they can work with to manage. Particle size, everything has to be. It's like 3 bears, not too big, not too small. Particle size, if they're too big, that means there's a lot of food blocked on the inside they can't eat. But if they're too small, the pores are going to be really tiny, and you're not going to get air in. And porosity, again, too big, you're not going to be able to hold water. You're not going to be able to hold heat. Too small, you can't get air in. Carbon to nitrogen ratio, too big, microbes won't have the nitrogen they need. Too small, there's going to be an overabundance of nitrogen. It will be lost to the atmosphere. Too much water, you fill the pores. Not enough water, microbes are homeless. Oxygen, well, not enough oxygen, you go anaerobic, start generating odors. You don't really get too much oxygen. You can't get too much air, though. If you're blowing too much air through, you can dry things out, and you can also cool things down too much. Now we're getting into the why would we use this stuff section of the discussion. All right. Compost, when you put it into a soil, it's providing organic matter, correct? And the organic matter is the foundation for everything else that's going on in the soil that's alive. Microbes, fungi decompose that organic matter. Then other organisms decompose those microbes and those fungi, and you end up with this whole trophic network all the way up through animals. So you want to use compost to create a healthy soil. And Janet talked about some of the reasons, some of the benefits she's seen in turf. The microbes are on your side. Now, microbes want your plants to succeed. Most of them. Most of them are really beneficial. They're living on organic matter. If the plants up above are growing and healthy and sending out roots and root exudates, that's food for them. So it makes sense for them to try to improve the porosity of the soil, to improve the health of the soil. Now these bacteria, as I said, they're smaller than fungi. Both fungi and bacteria are going to decompose the compost in the soil, but it's going to be stabilized. It's not going to happen really quickly because that really quick decomposition already happened in the compost pile. What's left over after composting is more resistant, recalcitrant materials where the bacteria and fungi can live for a good, healthy amount of time. Now, in the soil, the microbes, the fungi send out hyphae that are like these roots that run through the soil and kind of bind soil particles together. The bacteria give off polysaccharides, which act as glue, carbonaceous materials that act as glue and kind of paste soil particles together. And they form aggregates. When you have a soil that's aggregated, it's said to have good structure. And that's because an aggregated soil is going to hold water, it's going to allow air to penetrate, it's going to facilitate drainage and salt removal, it's going to allow roots to penetrate. So if you have a heavy soil, it basically makes it more open and improves tilth. If you have a light soil, you're going to be able to hold more nutrients, hold more water. So it's good either way. They're also, these aggregates are more stable and they're going to resist erosion. So you're going to have less sheet erosion, which is this kind of broad erosion off the landscape. Less rill erosion, which are those rivulets you see that eventually become gullies and canyons. I have with Bill Baker, we just wrapped up our first stage of a use index, and Danielle is helping with that too, which is a collaboration of state, university, industry, and growers to come up with a way of specifying desirable properties for compost. In other words, how do you know if a compost is going to be good for a particular application? And our first cut, we were looking at agricultural crops. And we considered lettuce, canning tomatoes, strawberries, avocado, grapes, and blueberry. And we are now able to describe what are the properties of compost that are appropriate for each of these except for blueberry, because I found out there wasn't enough science there for they were really low pH and were eating this stuff. And so there were certain questions about metals, and I had trouble, I had trouble coming up with metal concentrations that I could stand by and say, yeah, we know what's going to happen, because they are grown, down there around 5 as far as the pH. But for the others, we have good numbers. The goal of this, first of all, it's based on measurable properties. We don't ask how the stuff was created, because we're not there to see it. These are things that you can actually measure in a laboratory. And the goal of this was really to protect against people using products that just harm their landscape, harm their crop. It protects against metals, salts, pathogens, and maturity, which, as you will recall, relates to how well cured the material is so that you don't have phytotoxic compounds in there. And I can go into that in more detail. Right now, it's only been implemented for agriculture. I do think its real benefit is going to be when we're funded to expand it into landscape uses. Because in agriculture, you really, sometimes with mulches you're using a lot, but generally it's fairly small amount. In the landscape, you're using enough material that you're actually changing right away the properties of the soil. In an agricultural situation, you're not applying enough to modify soil properties right away. It usually takes 6 or 7 years because they just can't afford to apply it at a rate that would do that. But in a landscape, you really, really can. And you want to know what the impact of EC is going to be so that you know how you're going to be managing your water if you've been using your compost. That's just as an example. So in conclusion, a composter's success in managing the process is going to determine their product quality and consistency. And another reason to have these specs is to encourage consistency. How do you find a good compost? Well, right now, specs aren't really available to you, so you're going to go by reputation and your nose. Who's been producing compost successfully for a while? And if it smells rancid, not like it smells, a little bit, but if it smells like rotten, you don't want to use that. How do we use compost? There are 3 basic uses that people talk about: soil amendments, mulches, and organic fertilizers. Okay? I'm going to just very quickly touch on each of these. A mulch, though, people say, well, did you use compost or mulch? Well, that's really wrong. A mulch is anything you apply to the surface of a soil. You can use plastic mulches. You can use gravel as a mulch. You can use bark. You can use ground-up tires, even, some people I've seen use. You can use compost as a mulch, in which case it's compost and a mulch, so it's not either or. It's whenever you're applying to the surface of a soil to control weeds, prevent erosion, or beautify the environment, that's a mulch, and compost can do that. The properties of a compost you're using as a mulch are going to be a little bit different. Probably you're going to have a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio because you don't want it to be rich in nutrients. You're trying to suppress weeds, right? You don't want to put a soil on top of the soil to grow weeds. You want something that's going to have, a little more carbon, a little less nitrogen. Probably going to have larger particle sizes too, because you don't want it to be a seedbed again for weeds, and you want it to protect the soil from falling precipitation. You want low trash levels, and maturity is probably less important because it's not going to be. Plants are most susceptible to toxicity when they're very, very young, right in the soil, and you're going to be above the soil and not in contact with them. But maturity is always important. Soil amendments. Soil amendments are when you're putting it into the soil and you're modifying soil properties. These changes take time. You can get changes right away if you apply enough in a landscape. In agriculture, again, it's going to take 6, 7, 8 years at agronomic rates, which are, you're really just talking a fine dusting in agriculture most of the time. The soil properties, though, in the landscape are going to be, you're going to change it because the compost particles themselves change the soil, but that's not really how you change the soil when you use compost. What happens is those microbes, as they break down the compost, form aggregates. Remember those soil aggregates? And those persist even if the compost decomposes, unless you go out there and stomp around or drive over or otherwise destroy the structure of the soil. These have long-term benefits. Soil amendments, salinity is more likely to be a concern, as is maturity, because again, you're right there in the root zone. Organic fertilizers. These are slow-release fertilizers. Compost nutrient content is usually, it's not immediately available because the carbon has to break down in the compost to release the nitrogen. We also can't say when that nitrogen is going to be available the way you can with an inorganic conventional fertilizer or even a slow-release fertilizer, because the nature of the materials typically varies a bit from batch to batch. Although some, like biosolids compost tend to be pretty darn consistent. But we just don't have good data, and scientifically we're not really able to say. We do know that it's going to, because soils are warmer in the summer, it's going to be released faster in the summer than in the winter by quite a bit. But we can't say with precision. So really, when you're using composts as a nutrient source, you got to think more in terms of long-term budgeting. And you want to reduce what you're applying. In agriculture, we grow crops that need a whole bunch of nutrients all at once, typically. They have a fast growth period. And compost doesn't do that. But in the landscape, when you're growing turf, you want slow, gentle nutrient availability over time. Compost can work very, very well for that. But again, we're a little bit imprecise as to how it's going to be available. The best way to, I think, manage the nutrients in composting is just by paying attention. If you're growing plants, you can just, check the leaves. And if they look like they need nitrogen, they might. And you can check it with a cardimeter, or do plant analysis is another way to do it. Low carbon to nitrogen ratios are better for fertilizers. Next. Conclusions to my mini lecture. Mulches, soil amendments, and organic fertilizers are uses, not products. Compost can serve any of these. By the way, compost, usually they're not labeled for nutrients, and that's because the state has laws that says if you have a nutrient claim, you have to meet your nutrient claim. And again, these composts come from, there's a little bit of variability. They're not making it out of a machine, so they can't guarantee the nutrients. You might be able to, if you work with a composter, request analysis, but it's not going to be a guaranteed analysis, and they're not going to market it as a fertilizer. The exception would be some boutique products where they actually do go in and, through careful analysis and sometimes supplementation, guarantee that. Different composts are going to have different properties, and some are going to be more suitable for some uses than others. So that's it. Thank you.